Okay, so just to review again, I'm going to do just a walkthrough of this objects lab from the very beginning, from Canvas itself into my local environment. We'll do a quick review of some object stuff, and then we'll just start looking through this lab and trying to see how we might approach some of the tests. So here I am on my Canvas. I'm going to go ahead and fork. I already forked this before, so it shows up here, but that's fine. I can just go ahead and click that, and it goes right to it. So here I am on my own fork, and I'm going to go ahead and clone it down, SSH, copy that, and go ahead and clone it. So git clone, now that I've copied that SSH thing, git clone will clone it down, and I'll cd into that right there. And here it is, so I can go ahead and open it in code. Okay, cool. So here it is in code. The lab itself is basically requiring you to work through and create a few different objects. And basically, we'll see, we end up working with creating new objects or modifying existing objects as we work through these challenges here. But before we really jump into that, I want to show a few things that might be helpful in general for debugging just for you all. So this lab and a few of the labs around this are set up in a particular way where they actually have an HTML file in here. And I just want to note here that actually this index.js file is loaded into the HTML file in this script tag. So what that means is that if you open this HTML file, whatever you write in JavaScript, this file will load up in the browser, and you can do stuff. You can see it. So like this is actually the more sort of traditional way that we often debug. I know in some of the pre-work content you learned the debugger in the node environment. I'll show you the debugger in console now, just so everyone can see it. So let me just put something in here. So we'll console log something. Let's say, first of all, since we are reviewing objects, let's create an object. And I don't actually want to modify it. I'm going to make it const. So how do we create an object? Does anyone remember what the two different ways we could do it?
Curly braces.
Yeah, that's the most common way, and that's honestly like the easiest way. It's usually the sort of literal way. It's called literal syntax because we're saying this is an object, and it's also what we see when we actually output objects. So these curlies. So yeah, an empty object would be just open and closed curly braces, and then the other thing about objects is we can add keys and values. So sort of like a dictionary with words and definitions, we can add a key like anything, title, and give it a value. And you can add as many keys as you want. These are all unique, built as much as however you want to, whatever you want to populate this out with. You can create any key and any value. Keys are typically written like this. They are saved as strings in JavaScript, but you can write them without them with this colon here. It's called syntax sugar. Effectively, you'll hear that a few times the course, just to make it a little easier visually. And for writing, JavaScript will let you write just some kind of word here that represents a key, followed by a colon, and then the value. Value can be whatever you want. It could be numbers, it could be arrays, or it can be its own objects. So in this case, like an ID probably usually is a number, so we'll just give it a 1. Cool, so I had this very basic object I've created here, and I want to show you this thing I was talking about with logging in the browser. So now that I have this thing declared, if I go and log this, now we know from the labs that if I go ahead and run like node index.js while I'm in the assignment folder, it's going to run this file and it should log that object. So let's see. Cool. So there's the object being logged. So we can know that this should be working in the node. We can also, so if I reveal this in Finder and open this in the browser, I can click on it here to open the browser. Another way you can do that is you can type open index.js. For Windows user, it's explorer.exe followed by the file name. actually, sorry, so that's not, I made a mistake. It's not JS, it's HTML. So open HTML, we'll open this, and you can see that hello is in that HTML file. So that's that hello here. Now, we've loaded the script for index.js. So if I go and right click and go to inspect here and go to console, I now have this object logged here. So I click it and there's that object. That's what I would actually just put in there. So, I mean, no, it's actually, it looks a little different. This is what it looks like in Node being logged. And in the browser console, it's also being logged, but Chrome kind of does a few things. It's like, oh, this is an object, so I'm going to make it look nice for you and give you some nicer formatting. So yeah, 2 ways you can log things in your files. Any questions about that?
So I think I know this part, but every time I try to open in my VS, it says I need to put a phase password for it.
Oh, it
Yeah.
asks you for a password in the terminal?
Yeah.
It shouldn't. That's strange. You might have to look at your screen and see what that does. Do you mind waiting for a little while, Crystal, and we can take a look at that together, or?
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay, all right. I'll just go through. I'll go through this stuff, and then maybe we can break off in a little bit and take a look. So yeah, as I was saying, you can log these. You can log here. You can also log in the browser. So now, as we work in here, we have 2 ways we can kind of check our work and see what's going on. So I want to do a few more things just to quickly review objects. So we know objects are these things that are wrapped in curly braces, and they have keys and values. This is very commonly called, it's known as a data structure, because it's basically, it represents data. We can say things like, we could describe a thing like a dresser for clothing might have a height in some value, a width, a color, right? So like the reason why we call these data structures is because you can create all kinds of really complex data objects in JavaScript that represent actually real world things. In this case, you might have, like, if you were designing a bunch of furniture application, you could have a bunch of different furniture pieces that all have their own values. And I need to turn off my Slack. But that way, like, you might have, hold on one second, I'm going to quit out of my Slack. So in this case, like, you could have a bunch of objects that might represent different things that then work together. So if you had an app for designing furniture or placing things in the room, maybe you have a bunch of different furniture items that have different sizes that you could then use to represent on an app, for instance. Or you might have something like an employee. This will be relevant to the assignment. An employee object in a program you're running, where you'd have an employee name, like, some name. You might have their a particular ID tied to them. So maybe they have like an employee ID, or that could also be a number. That's fine. And some other data. You can even have like nested objects, occupation, title, that kind of thing, and whatever other attributes you might want to tie into this kind of object. So like this whole object itself really can potentially represent an entire person in a system. So that's why it's called a data structure. It stores data. Brief tangent, what's the other data structure we've seen in the pre-work? Does anyone remember? It would be the array. which very similarly, you define by in the literal syntax by just providing the proper brackets. So in this case, it's curly braces, and these are square brackets. And arrays can be empty or filled with content, any sort of value. And they also, just like objects, can have their own, can be nested inside themselves. Similarly, you can nest arrays in objects as well. Okay. Any questions about that basic stuff, about objects? Okay. So before we go into this lab, I think it might be better if we just do some quick review of some of the things we're going to use here. So there's some things about objects that we need to keep in mind, and also about variables in general. If I want to access a value on this employee object, let's say I want to access the value associated with this name key, how would I access it? Let's just log this and see. What do I add at the end of employee?
Dot.
Dot.
Name.
Yeah, dot name. So if I refresh this, I'll refresh it and I can see Frank Smith is now being logged because employee.name is being logged. Same with ID, occupation. Now occupation, because I have made it an empty array, it just returns that empty array. That's what's being logged. What's the other way we can access an ID or a value, a key here?
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Does it matter if you're using console log or if you're using return?
It does. It sort of, well, it depends on what you want to do. Console log just shows things in the browser or in the log, like in this case, but it doesn't do anything. But like if you had a function that needs to return something, then this will not work for you.
Okay, all right, that makes sense.
Yeah, can anyone tell me what the other, besides dot notation, what's the other option for accessing stuff inside of an object?
Bracket notation.
Yeah, exactly. Bracket notation. So in this case, what goes inside of the bracket? If I want to access name here, what goes in here?
The index property starting with 0.
0? What do you think? Okay, so what happens if we refresh here?
I think you put
Oh,
the
so would it be
variable name.
Oh, sorry, what was that?
Key. You
Key?
write the key.
Oh,
Or sorry, whatever you were trying to access. So name
like the key? Sure, yeah. So would this work?
to get his name.
I'm sorry, what's up?
No, nothing. Forget it.
I think you have to put it in quotations.
Yeah, exactly. You have to provide
Okay.
a string in here. And what happens is when you provide this string inside of these brackets, the JavaScript just knows like, okay, I'm going to try to match whatever you provided me with whatever one of these keys, and it will look it up directly. It will say, is this a key? And because these keys actually, even though you don't see it in JavaScript and like this, they are stored as strings. You're directly looking this up. So it's either this exists as a string, a key, or you get undefined. So in this case, if I refresh, I'll get the name again, but anything that is not valid, if I make a typo, for instance, into nam, it'll be undefined because it's looking up the key nam on this employee, and that doesn't exist, so it returns undefined.
What would be a situation where you would use a bracket instead of dot notation?
That's a great question. And so that's actually what I want to talk about next. So like, let's say we have, well, I'll just answer it right now. Basically, the main difference is if you do not notation, you have to be explicit in what you're looking at. So I have to say dot name in this case, and that will return Frank Smith. In the bracket notation, this will also return Frank Smith. That's fine. However, what happens a lot in programming is that this might be a variable. So if we were, for instance, to name it key, and then made a variable said key is equal to name, So we declare this right above it, and then we access employee by passing in this variable. This variable evaluates to the string name, so that returns Frank again. So if I refresh this, Frank Smith. But because it's a variable, it could be whatever I want. I could now change this to ID, and I haven't made any modification to my code down here, but now I'll return the number instead. So what this allows you to do is, as opposed to saying employee that name, where you have to always get the name, this is abstract. This is now some code that will access whatever I want based on whatever I make key. Does that make sense?
That definitely does.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in this case, if key was in quotes, would the bracket notation become more of like a smart sort of like a more of an intelligent identifier?
That's a good question. So what do you think is going to happen when I do that, when I log this now? What is your guess?
I would say probably ID.
Refresh, yeah, undefined.
Okay, undefined again.
Any guesses why you think that might be?
Because it's reading it as a string.
Yeah, because it's literally, it's saying, okay, you want to search for a key that's equal to the key of this string, which happens to be the word key. So like you're just giving it, if it would be valid if there was a actual thing named key here that had some value it was pointed to. So like this is actually this is being literal again, whereas when you make it a variable, it becomes abstract because it's just going to point to some reference that we set previously.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, good. It's definitely like a pretty tricky thing. And what happens a lot too is that you'll see, and one thing that often trips up students early on is functions where you have something like, I'm sorry, an example function where you take in some variable called example, and you have to do something with that variable. So some of the labs earlier on, they ask you to say like, to return a particular phrase. Like, let's say we wanted this function to return, hello, Steve. And we had a variable named that we had said is like name, we'll just say a name and call it Steve. So I could return, if I wanted this, if this is my only goal from this function, I could do a very hard-coded hello, Steve, which technically fulfills the requirement for if I was only going for this. But once I want to go more abstract, I might want to have a function that can take in any name and return hello to that name, right? So that way I can just easily change one thing. And I want this function to return that thing. What I would do is, instead of doing a hard-coded solution like this, I might do something like this, where I interpolate a variable being passed in. And then when I call this function, I just pass in some other thing that might be Brett. It could be another variable that's pointed to some string, or it could be the string itself. This will now give me hello, Steve, and I can now call it again and say hello, Brett. And both of these will return, this will say hello, Steve, and this one will return hello, Brett. So like by making this a little more abstract, we can now make a function that does all kinds of things. It's a similar concept here. And actually we can do things like create a function that, for instance, returns a value from an object. So like, let's say we read this function where we say, given an object and a key, return the value of that key, value associated with that key in the object. If we wanted to get a value, how would we do that? Given like an object and a key that's in that object, how would we, what would we write in return here?
The object.key.
Close. Remember that key is actually, it's a variable. It could be anything, but it's actually representing something else. So I might call this with like, I could call this with, let me get rid of this example a little bit.
So how I did it, which I think I like hard coded almost all of it.
Okay.
But I did return object assign.
Yeah.
And then like a bunch of parentheses, empty brackets, employee, comma, and then the key, and then the key value, and then the next key and the next key value.
Yeah, and I think that's probably, I mean, you're definitely on the right track, and you're right that that's like in this lab, you'll end up using a lot of the object assign. I'm not quite there yet. I wanted to just make sure that there's this understanding of how key is actually kind of abstract, but what we should look at that right after this, I think.
Okay.
Ready. So like in this case, if I just want I want a function that returns the value of any key of a given object, I could write something like this, where what I now have is a value returner that's just like, hey, give me an object and a key, and I'll return that object. So if I were, for instance, kind of pass in this dresser object, and then give it a key that I want to find, let's say width, I should get back 30 if I run this function. Now, if I want to do some other thing in here, height, I'll get back 40, right? Or if I pass in some other thing entirely, like employee, and I don't want to look up the ID, pass in ID. And again, these, although this is called object and key, this key represents whatever is being passed in. So initially it's a string. This first one is width. This time it means it's equal to height. This time it's equal to ID. And when it's passed in, this object is pointing to different things depending on what you pass in the function. So this is, even though this code is very abstract and doesn't actually necessarily know what these two things are, we can write abstract code that does stuff for us and then give it the concrete details later. So this is like why it's so valuable to have this square bracket structure, because you can do these very simple sort of functions that are actually can do whatever you want, all kinds of complex stuff. Any questions right now before I go on to the first stuff in this lab?
Yeah, how would you do that with the object.assign? Because I didn't use any of that to finish this lab.
Yeah. So like, so before we let's see, let's do a quick refresher on object assign. So let's make two objects. And we'll give it some data. I always like picking IDs because it's often in there. And let's do another object here. Oh, I need to make sure no typos. Object 2 is equal to title. So like we have these two objects. If we wanted to combine these two, what are the two ways that we can combine them? So let's say we want to combine them and put them in a new object. So we'll say const new object is equal to something. What work has to be done on this half to combine these two?
Do you have to initialize a new object to put it into?
Yeah, that's one way to do it. So if we made a new object, then what do we have to do now if we have that structure?
So we have to initialize a new object.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. So if we made a new object, then what do we have to do now if we have that structure? If we made a new object, then what do we have to do now if we have that structure? If we made a new object, then what do we have to do now if we have that structure? Like, does this work? Let's try it. Let's see what- New object. Sorry, who? If I cut someone off just now. All right. Well, stop me again if you have any suggestions. But so let's just log this. We have this structure. If I log this now, that's interesting. So I got something, but check it out. I got an object. This whole thing is an object, and it has two keys in it, which is kind of strange. Named object 1 and object 2, and those have the stuff in them that from our two objects. So actually, this is valid JavaScript. This is sort of a not to be confused. This is also some syntax sugar. What we're doing in this case is by passing in a variable in modern JavaScript like this, JavaScript knows, okay, this is the literal object syntax. So if you give me a variable, I'm going to turn it into a key value pair where the key is whatever the variable name is, and the value is whatever the value is. So the result in this case is these key value pairs of these two objects.
Did that make those new objects nested, or is
Yeah.
that something? Okay, that's what I.
Yeah. So like now, if I wanted to get to, with this new object, if I wanted to get to the date key, I'd actually have to go in and say new object dot object 1 dot date, or new object 1 date, like that. And those will both give me the same thing here.
So could you still just do object 1 dot date, or would that not return? Like if you're, instead of adding the new object.
Oh, good question. Yes, because in this case you could, because this is still a valid thing up here.
Yeah.
If this won't work on this side because those are square brackets, so that's not valid JavaScript, just a bunch of square brackets in this case. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, so this is like, that's kind of proof that this object inside of it really is just this thing, so you can access it both ways. Yeah, so it's kind of, this is like the reason why I'm going into this is because this is often something that can trip you up, because of what I was talking about was how you might combine these two. So one way to do that is to use the spread operator. So what I have here are two objects that are, as I said, assigning a key value pair with this as the key and the value being the actual object. If I add dot dot dot, let's just do one for now. What does this do?
It makes a clone.
Yeah. What this is actually doing is it's taking this object and it's deconstructing it into its key value pairs. So by writing dot 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 object, we're effectively writing that. We're like saying it's this, and this should be the same thing. Or we could actually do this something like, well, that's fine. Yeah. So this is just taking this object and taking all the keys and values out and putting them in whatever it is. Since we have wrapped it in another set of curly braces, these key values just become key value pairs within this other object that's being created right now, and it becomes new object. So if I, just to confirm, spread operate object 1 into new object, and then I refresh the page, I now get all the data from object 1. Now, we saw when we add both the objects in without the dot dot dot. If we add them both in with dot dot dots, what do you think will happen here?
Will we get one object with the keys of both objects?
Yeah, exactly. It's going to deconstruct this first and say, okay, so these two things are going to get added to this object, and then it's going to go on to the next one and deconstruct that and add these two. So now if I refresh the page, I should get an object with all 4 things in it. Right? So seems pretty straightforward, right? Now what happens if I do something like this? I have an ID in object 1 and I have an ID in object 5. Sets of different values. What do you predict will happen when I log this now?
I think you'll get 5.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
It overwrites the second time the information passes through. You get the most recent one.
Yeah, exactly. So like it reads this first one, like, okay, cool. These are some key values we're going to add to this object. Reads the second one. This is okay, cool. You're going to add these values, but because there's already a key value that exists already, it's just going to overwrite it. So then this would be this is going to become whatever is in the second one will become whatever the value is. So if I refresh this, you can now see that 5 is now being logged as ID. So this is one way to combine things. You can combine as many objects as you want. You don't have to write them in this object or this variable type structure. You could do something like, I think this should work. If I did ID of A, B, C, because I'm actually creating an object with this key value and then immediately spread operating it, this will work. It's a little bit weird. Let's see what this does. ID ABC. I could also, because I'm already in an object and I'm writing the string literal, I can also do this, and this is also fine because this is the same thing. Declaring an object and spread and deconstructing it this way with the spread operator, it's the same thing as just passing them that same that whatever keys are inside that object. So, oh, someone have a question? Okay. So what's the other way we can do this? There's a different form of this sort of thing that we can use. Like if you want to combine these two. That's right. I'll give it to you. It's object dot assign. So whenever we write object dot assign, this function on object, it's actually in the objects. All these are objects. This is like the class, the original object. You can pass in other objects, and it will create a new object for you with that information based on the first one you pass in. So if I were to pass in, and I'll clarify that because I think that was not clear, but object 1, and I comment that, I'll just log in. I'll log new object 2. If I refresh this, I'll get the data from this first object, just stored in a different variable. If I then pass in more than one object, I get the same thing that I was getting without this part as this. So by passing in 2 objects and an object assign, it's the same thing as passing them in with the spread operator inside literal syntax. The one thing that actually, there is something that is distinctly different though, in that there's not an easy way to show you this besides just telling you. I'll check and see if there's an easier way, but when you use object.assign, it actually takes in the first argument and adds everything else after that into this object. So just, oh, I know how I can show you this. So if I go back to this for a second, I have the spread operator and I want to console log object 1. Object 1 is not modified at all here. We're just using it. We're breaking it up into its key values and making this new thing. So if we refresh this, I should just see ID 10 and date, which is the original object. If, however, I put that log here and I refresh this, so now we have object 1 and assign here, and we're logging it here. If I refresh this, now I got all this other stuff. So by creating it with this process, we actually are creating a new object entirely. We're wrapping everything in these curly braces, which denotes a new object. In this case, this function or this particular method on object takes whatever you pass in as the first argument and combines everything into that object, this first one. This is sort of a red herring because we're actually directly modifying object one. We don't have to assign it to anything. We're pushing stuff into this object as key value pairs. Now, if I wanted to make this line act exactly like this, where I'm creating a new object, I would want to put it somewhere because I'm creating a new object and need to store it somewhere. Instead of passing object one as the first argument, I pass in an empty object. Because we're saying whatever, now this is now the object will push everything else into. And because we're just creating it on the fly as a new empty object here, if we log this now, object one remains unchanged because we aren't doing anything to object one. We're just pushing the values into this new thing. Now I can just confirm that new object two does have everything in it, and it also has the overwrite stuff here. Object one still has ID 10. Okay. Questions about that?
So
A question about the having to declare a variable in order to do object.assign, but you pretty much answered that.
Okay, yeah. This is just because we might have some that it does return whenever it's done, but if you are just passing in these two, it's going to return this object as, and even though it's been modified. But if you pass it,
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Wyatt, you had a question?
I was just gonna say, so the one curly, or the set of one curly brackets in there, that, what did that do exactly? It didn't destroy the first object?
Yeah, so like by passing in this object assign in particular, just because of the way this method is written, the first object you give it will become the one that you modify. So if you give it an empty one, you just create on the fly with the literal syntax, this becomes its own thing, which we then will copy whatever other stuff is here into this object. Once you take it away, this becomes the first argument. And so this is what gets modified by whatever else you give it.
And is that form destructive, the way you have it written?
Yeah, so like this would be the non-destructive way because you're creating a new object that's not going to mess with this one. But as soon as you do this, it will be destructive. Yeah, exactly. Okay, for the first one. Not destructive for this one. This is going to stay the same, but this one will be modified. So yeah, that's an important difference. Non-destructive, destructive. And again, just to reiterate, you can pass in whatever you want, as many things as you want. You can even you can declare things on the fly, objects into this. And that's fine. Just the main thing you gotta remember is whatever you put in at the beginning will be the thing that's modified. So some students find this one a little more approachable because you don't have to worry about this like extra thing here that kind of potentially modifies. This will always create a new object because you're wrapping it in a new object syntax. You're saying create this new object and just put some stuff in it. Here you're saying like take this object that I give you and put some other stuff into it. Okay, how does that sound so far?
Great.
Cool. All right.
Great. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. So now that we've talked about this, I think we should be able to take a look at the assignment. So I'm going to just start fresh. What I recommend often is like, before you do anything, I often just run the tests and see what happens. So I'm going to have to npm install and npm test. Cool. So I got 6 errors. First one, employee is not defined. Okay, so it looks like this just doesn't, it's looking for something called employee. All right, so what happens if we write let employee equal Steve? Run the test again. Okay, well, now it's failing more. But update. Okay, so it doesn't give me the employee error. It seems to be okay with employee now, so I can just keep going. So now it's saying this is not defined. Well, okay. If I look at the message, you can kind of get a hint of what it's looking for. What has parentheses at the end, so it's probably a function. So I'll say function. And it looks like it wants 3 things. So I'll just copy these in because that's what it's looking for and close it up. Cool. If I run this test again. All right, well, it's not failing that first one, but now it's like expected undefined to deeply equal object. Okay. Undefined. So this is not very helpful. Obviously, like I don't know what's going on here. Well, we know at this stage that this test is trying this function. Couldn't find the function before. Now it's trying it and it's returning some other message. So what's actually happening in the tests, and I can look at it. You're welcome to look at the tests and get some hints from here too. Sometimes they're not very they're pretty dense and like confusing. If they are, don't worry about it, but you can sometimes derive some stuff. So for instance, I can see here just from the tests, I have something going on. If you recall from the previous error, actually, when I didn't have employee, the first error I was getting was like employee is not defined. And then it would have this message before each hook returns blah, 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 blah. Well, that's weird. But if I know in the tests, there's a before each thing here. And you can see, okay, it's doing something to an employee. And it's actually deleting the keys. So, and if you all recall from your for loops, this is saying, okay, so every key in employee, okay, that seems like maybe an employee must be an object. Delete employee key. Oh, okay. And then employee.name is equal to Sam. So like by looking at this, I can tell you employee is going to be an object. It's not going to be an array because an array wouldn't have this kind of thing on it. You couldn't assign a dot notation to something like that. So employee looks like it's going to have to be an object. So leave it like that for now. I don't, and it seems to be deleting all the keys anyway, so maybe that's fine. If we run the test again, we still are going back to where we were a moment ago, which is this expected undefined to deeply equal. Okay. So it's failing, and you can actually get some data off of this test saying this is actually written to be like, this is what's going wrong. This is the actual error. It expected this and it got something else. And it's happening at test/index.js 12 at character 90. So this is line 12. If I go to line 12, it's right here. It's character 90, so somewhere in here it's failing. I'm not going to count to 90, but I can see what it's doing, even though I don't know what expect does necessarily. It is calling this function here, and it's passing an employee, which I kind of have a sense about. It's passing in strings too, street address and Broadway. And then it's saying to EQL, which y'all might guess, and actually it's kind of down here too, equal is what it's saying too. So it's expecting this call to this function to equal this thing, which is an object with 2 key values. So just by reading through these tests, you can kind of get a sense of what's going on. This is, even if you don't, it's okay, I'll just explain it. This is all very new, and I understand. This before each kind of, so by its name, by what it kind of hints at its name, this fires before every test. Before each test, it's going to do this little routine, which is what it's doing is it's going to get employee value, clear it all out, and add Sam to it. So when this test runs, I expect employee to actually equal just an empty object, but with Sam in it. So what, and Can't really test it too easily in this case. What we could do though is, because the test is calling it here, but we actually have defined it over here, I can console log and see what employee is. Even though this is one thing that's kind of confusing with this lab, this is not really, you're not passing this particular thing in initially or immediately. You are defining it here, and the test is then overriding it and adding its own value and then passing it in. So anyway, I'm going to get ahead of myself. Let's just log, see when we call this function, let's log what employee, key, and value are. I'm going to run this test again. Now, when you run tests and you log stuff, it's going to be a little bit hard to catch sometimes, but you're going to have to like look through the messages. But here is my log. So, and this is actually when this function is being called, it's logging name Sam, and then the 2-second arguments. And again, it tries it again, name Sam, and the 2-second arguments here. So, and it seems to be passing one test, strangely, even though I haven't done too much yet. So what we can see then from these logs is that this test is calling it here. It's also actually happens, if you notice, it's calling it down here, same function, which is why it's being logged twice. This first one is here. This second one is down here. So what can we surmise about this? We know that by logging it, we know that initially when employee is passed in on this function in the tests, employee is equal to an object that just has name Sam in it. And it expects it to return an object with name Sam and street address 11 Broadway. So we have those two here. We have the original object. Now, so we have a sense of what these might be. If we want to add whatever this key value pair is to this employee, how do we do it?
We have to add empty keys to the employee variable.
Yeah, can you tell me what to type?
So under let employee, we could do street colon and quotes, like empty quotes, and then inline and do. Sorry, I forgot what the second key was.
Oh, it's yeah, 11 Broadway. Yeah. So it's a good guess. And you are, I mean, this is what kind of what you want to add is it's actually, I think, street address. But if you recall from the test where we're looking at this, when we define this, every time this test runs, it actually takes that, it goes and gets that employee object we just made and clears it out. So if I were to console log this again, employee, this is still only going to log Sam, even though I've added this thing in here, because whatever you put in here,
yeah,
it's getting erased.
I guess what I was trying to do was make like empty keys for it, like just do like street address and then like do empty quotations and then underneath that do the other key value and leave that empty, so it just has something to like plug in. That's just my thinking. I don't think
that's
it's
a good
right,
guess.
though.
And that's not wrong. As long as you understand, like this actually gets destroyed in the part of the testing, but this is not a bad idea. Like if you're building, like you'll eventually get to play to projects where you have like a default object, and this might be what the default object looks like. It's just like a bunch of keys with some empty strings, because I might have 100 employee objects, but I want them all to have the same keys and values. So like by declaring them like this, then you could have like a function in your program that knows, okay, I'm working with an employee object. Well, an employee object always has name on it, so I can work with that kind of thing. So this is not wrong in terms of setup. Just in this particular case, these get obliterated every time the test runs, no matter what.
Right. Okay.
So we're going back to this. We have this function here that we see as being called in the tests, and we can see that we've got some logs. We know it's being called. It's passing in an employee, which only has one key on it, Sam. It's his name equal to Sam, and then this new key and a new value. So that's the same as what's happening over here. This is just the parameters of them. Any suggestions?
Uh,
Yeah.
I made that pass by making a new object with the spread operator. Not, I didn't do it as return. I made,
Oh.
I guess I made a new.
Like a new.
Yeah, I did const, but yeah, you could do let new object
Sure.
equal the spread operator of employee.
Okay.
And then I did new object with bracket notation key to equal value. And then I returned the new object, and that made it pass.
Yep. Yeah, so that's a valid way to do it. This is the essential part, that you're taking this, whatever this key is. It could be, in this case, it's street address, but it could be something else, and that value, and just adding that particular abstract key to that abstracted value. The one thing I would say in this case is you don't actually have to do this part, because it doesn't, in this particular situation, all this is testing is to see if the return is an object that has this stuff in it. So you can actually, you can return the original employee, and instead of create a new one, you could just do employee at this particular key, whatever is being given, set it to that whatever value is being given, and then return employee.
And that's not destructive?
That is destructive, actually, but in this case, we're not. It doesn't matter in this particular lesson or this function. That doesn't matter.
Okay.
It's not checking for that.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're right. We will have that will matter in pretty soon in later ones. Yeah. So yeah, this is let's just go through this again. We're passing in an employee that has only one key value pair, and then by running this, we're going to add whatever key it's given and make it that value. So in this particular case, it's adding street address and 11 Broadway, and returning that new modified object, which will be this thing here. So now let's go ahead and run the tests. And I returned 1. Wyatt, I apologize, and I eat my hat. You were absolutely right. So please retract what I just said. This is destructive, and that's not what they want. They want a new object in this test. It does not modify the original employee, rather returns a clone. So by creating this spread operator thing, we've actually created a new object with the same keys in it, but we're just creating a copy this way and assigning the key value, and then returning that thing. Now, can anyone tell me how we might rewrite this? So now if we run this test, it's passing both of the first one. So cool. Before we move on though, how might we rewrite this using object.assign? What goes inside?
I did an empty curly brace.
Yeah.
Or an empty object. And then I did employee and then like an object with key value, but I did that kind of a while ago and I'm not sure I can explain that thinking.
Yeah, no, that's a good guess too. So yeah, you're right though. Because if you recall from our review, this, if we added something like some other object here, like key value, which I'll explain in a minute. This would be destructive, because you remember that it's going to modify whatever the first argument is by adding this empty object at the beginning. Now it's going to modify this thing, so employee will remain untouched. So yeah, so this first part in this particular case, we'll do it a few ways. This is a valid solution because you're saying create a new object with all the employee key values, store it in this thing, and then you just make a model. You add the key value pair to that new object and return the new object. You could also, instead of having to do a separate line here, because object assign, as we recall, we'll just overwrite key value pairs and keep adding things as you add more objects. So you can also just make your own object here that will, that object assign will then say, okay, take this object, take everything from this object and put it in there. All right, cool. Now take everything from this object and put it in there. And what happens is, because of the bracket notation, that you may not have seen this as much, but this is valid. And just like bracket notation at the end of a thing like this can count as a key inside of a literal notation object like this. So just to be clear, this does not work because this is basically saying something like that. You're looking for the literal key. But by putting it in brackets, you're looking for the variable, whatever a key is equivalent to, which in this particular test is street address. So street address as a string is a valid key you can accept. And so this will work. And the same way that this works. Any questions about that?
I guess I have a question for someone else. Preeti, is this what you were talking about when you said you were hard coding stuff and using the object assign to get stuff to pass?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
This is not hard coding. Hard coding might be something like if you solve this by saying street address is equal to 11 Broadway. So the tricky thing in this case is that this is technically going to probably pass the test because the test is just saying like this is still going to create an object with this key value pair, which does validate the test.
Well, so okay, yeah.
Yeah, you see what?
Yeah, I'm
the
just
difference
looking
is there.
back at my code.
And like that's fine. Like it'll happen. Don't worry about it. Sometimes these tests are very particular, or like that even though you might understand the concept and what you're doing, the test doesn't always wants a very specific thing. In this case, it's the opposite. The test is actually a little too loose and like will accept anything that results in this object. So you could actually then you could also hard code this by just returning that will also pass the test. But that's obviously not that's not what you want. You just
right.
So yeah, the main goal of this is to understand like you can write functions that are super abstract. It doesn't matter what these three things is, even though they're called employee, key, and value. This could be the dresser object I talked about before, and then this could be some other key and value, and it will return whatever we give it. It'll do this work for us and return a result and always the same thing if you give it the same arguments like this. One other thing you can do, so like in this case, we're assigning an object with this object assigned and then returning the object. You can also just cut this down. So you'll see often like something like this, where you just return the result of this operation. Okay, any questions before I go on to the next thing? Okay, cool. I probably won't go through this whole lab. I think I'll just go through the next section and then leave you all to if you want to keep working on your own, you're welcome to do that. So what's the next one? Okay, cool. All right, let's run the tests. Cool. So this one is destructively update employee with key and value. Oh, okay. Hey, so we kind of did that already with the previous example. And it's going to be called destructively update this time. And in this case, well, now we know the difference between destruction and non-destruction. We can write something very similar to this, but what do we have to modify? We can actually just take this and put this in here, but what do we change in this line now?
We can just take away that empty object at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. Now we're saying, okay, destroy this, whatever this thing is, modify it. And this will now pass that test. just to be sure, what's another way we could do this? What if we're given this employee, we want to modify this employee?
I did it just like the little employee key in brackets equals a value.
Yeah.
Little.
Little? Oh,
No, yeah, like I just liked it because it was smaller.
oh okay. Yeah, and that's a return employee. Yeah, and this is actually kind of what we had originally in the previous. We had partial solution up here doing this destructive one. So this is totally fine too. You don't have to do this whole object assign thing. You're just modifying a key value on this particular employee and returning that thing. So either of these, that will also be a valid test solution. Yep, so that passes it. Cool. All right, let's go to just one more. So now the next one is delete from employee by key. Okay. So, if I look at the test messages, well, first thing we know, it's not defined. Well, that's a hint that we have to define it. So we'll say function. And if I go back here, it tells me what gives you a hint of what you're looking for. So employee and key. Let me just clean this up a little bit, this stuff. So delete from employee key. And in this case, I can kind of skip ahead and read the both tests so I can prevent my previous mistake with Wyatt and say, okay, well, this does not modify the original employees. I know in advance that I can't be modifying that original employee. So now that we've gone through these two sort of these versions where we have non-destructive and destructive, we want non-destructive. So how do we delete this key value pair from this employee or this object really non-destructively?
The test said to clone it, so I did the same object at assign with the empty curly braces and just employee.
Yep. So we can say this is a new object or something. Yeah. So this creates a new copy of an object that this is the object now with some from whatever data from employee. Yep. And then what do we do?
I used the delete object thing, delete, and then I called it deleted employee. But so you would do new object and then key in brackets.
Yep. New object key. Yeah. And
then I just return.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Always want to return there. Cool. So this is slightly different structure than you might see in other cases. But yeah, this is totally valid JavaScript. Delete, and then provided a key in an object, it will delete that key value. Now if we run this again. Cool. We passed all the tests. Also another one that might work. Let's see if this works. New object key, our key is undefined. So this also works. Even though we're assigning this thing undefined, undefined is actually a thing in JavaScript. It's its own object. It's basically represents false in some cases, but it also represents nothing. So functions that don't have a return object return undefined because it's saying it does return something. It just says it's not defined. So by assigning a key to a value of undefined, it actually just makes this key not, it actually just basically makes that key unusable. So let's see if we just make sure that I'm not misleading you. Let's, instead of returning, let's console log this one. Oh, I'm totally wrong. Hey, I misled you and I'm so sorry. So undefined does not work. It does create a key. It just signs as not defined. So that's kind of weird. I mean, it's actually, I should have expected that. But so this method does not work. But by deleting with the command, that will work. And there it is. Yeah. Okay. Sorry for that misinformation. Please strike that from the record. Any questions about this? Okay. So I'm gonna leave you, if you all want to keep working on this lab, you're welcome to. But what are the questions you all have? What can I help you with in general? Anything else that's not related to the objects that you have a question about while I'm here?
I actually had a totally unrelated question, and it's concerning JavaScript in the DOM.
Sure.
So I'm already at the point where I'm making my portfolio website, and I'm trying to basically do a mouse over event, like add an event on my page.
Sure.
I was wondering if you could just go through like adding an event by looking up an ID on like an HTML doc.
Yeah.
Like if I wanted to do a simple mouse over to like change an ID, you know, like an ID tag on that element.
Yeah. So yeah, let's try that. It'll be a little experimental. I always forget some of the specific events, but we can certainly try. So let's first let's create something to target. So let's say let's do a button. Or no, button's gonna be a little strange. Let's do a div. We'll put the hello in there and give it an ID. So something like that, something to target it. Right. So we're gonna just now that we've gone over this, I'm going to just comment all of that. Cool. So, and importantly, also just to note, the script is loaded after this, so I don't have to. I can just start accessing stuff. I can access that ID because this is actually loaded first. The way that when you run a page, it goes line by line in the browser, loads this up into DOM, and then runs this script. And so the script now has access to this. To be clear, if this was up here, it would not unless you had an event for DOM content loaded.
Right, right, yeah.
Right. There is a new modern one, which is defer. That also will work just fine. That does the same thing as having it down here. We'll just keep it down here for now because that's how it was. Cool. So we have this div and that has hello in it and has ID of my ID. So anyone remember how you access an ID based on the does it go over that in the materials? I can't remember. I know they do query selector, right?
Yeah, I would do query selector usually.
Yeah, it's like the multi-tool. It does all of them for you because query selector, if you're looking for a div, you just write div within the string. If you're looking for,
yeah, I've also used get element by ID.
Yeah, that also works. Yeah, they should both work. If you're doing this one, you have to add the hashtag, so for my ID in this case. And then the alternative would be get element by ID, and then you can just do that because it knows it's an ID. So these should both return the same thing. You just A, B. So if you recall, since I'm loading this up in JavaScript, I can now access these variables in the console, which is pretty handy. So they're both one of the same thing. I don't need both of them. Just a point to show that you can get these things more than one way. So cool. So we have this thing. Let's give it a proper name. We'll say it's my div because that's trying to target this entire div, right? Now you wanted to add an event listener to this thing, right? So that would be, how do we do that before we talk about exactly what? But it would be my div what?
My div dot add event listener.
Yep, and it gives us the shortcut here. It's already filling it in for us. And then event listeners, if you actually, it gives you some hints in VS Code. Like in this case, once I made the parentheses, it's like, okay, well, it's expecting a type of element event map. I'm not really sure what that is, but kind of gives you a hint of it. And then also this listener. I apologize. This is actually not very helpful at all. This, but what just to go through on my own words, add event listener
Right, it
takes
took me
in.
totally off guard with this.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
It's fine.
So yeah, add event listener takes in 2 arguments. The first one is a string that represents the event. So it might be like submit or mouse over, that kind of thing.
I think it is mouse over.
Yeah. And then the second one is a function that you call on the event. So it'd say like function. We can write an anonymous function here by just doing this. So saying like whenever this happens, just call this function. I don't care what it's named, just do something. So let's just console log it. Right? All right, let's see what happens.
Is another mouse JavaScript event like mouse click?
There is a click one.
It's just click.
Yeah, just click will also.
It's click, yeah, click, and then there's the mouse leave, I think.
Yep.
Or
and that's like when you're hovering over it.
I think it's like, so if you notice here, like clicking is logging hover here. If I do it to mouse over, as soon as I hover over it, oh, you know what? Actually, in the console, I think you might not be able to see it. So let me close this out. So like I'll refresh the page and I'll hover over it a few times with my mouse. And now it did log it. It won't log it when I'm in the editor because it's actually like, you can see my cursor has changed to this circle. It's not going to trigger the same events, but it does work when you're not in the dev tools. So one thing you might say is like, as to make it a little clearer, since dev tools are a little bit confusing, background, let's make a background change. So as soon as I hover it, it should change color and change it permanently because it's just set in the background once, right? But we can add multiple event lists. What's up? Sorry.
The .style .background I think is where I got stuck because I wouldn't know to add the style dot notation.
Yeah. This is like always required for JavaScript CSS. Like if you're trying to modify CSS directly in the JavaScript, you have to use that style. It's just part of the it's part of the DOM element that you're working on.
Okay, so even if I didn't have like a style tag or a style element in my HTML file, that would still be valid.
Yeah, you can on the fly create whatever styling you want in JavaScript like this. Yeah, and these will be equivalent to whatever you see in a CSS file. The one big difference is like in CSS, you might have, for instance, or let's just create a file. For divs, you might have a rule. It's like background color is blue. And it's not saved yet, so it doesn't know it's a CSS. So it's formatting toward this dash here in JavaScript would actually have to be camel cased into that. But it's the same thing. It's just that because JavaScript, they set it up, they didn't put the dashes in, they set it up camel case like this. So everything you can do in here, you can do off of .style, just slightly model. You might have to look it up to find the difference, like this case. But again, in this case, background and background color both change the background color, so this will work. So in this case, we have this code here that will always set it one way, but not the other way. Because mouse over, as soon as you mouse over, it does this. But I think we can do something like mouse out for a different event. So these are both tied to the same object, same element, but they're different events. Now, if I think this will work, hover over and hover out, over, out, over, out, over, out, over. So like this is actually the div itself is just, you can kind of see like this div is that whole bar. It's across the entire page. And if I mess with the CSS, you can even see, what I'll do is I'll add a style.css file. And I'm just gonna copy this in here. And let's say the height of this div is 100 pixels. I also need to make sure to link this in. So I think it's, what is it, link? Ref? I'm forgetting if that's valid. I can't remember. I think it's href. Nope. Oh, and rel style sheet. And yep. Notice the difference. It's like this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this CSS is still applying, but whatever is in here is still affecting it too.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, events are pretty cool. And you can do as many as you want on the same element. You will override it if it's the same element. Like this will just be end up being this one will be the one.
Right.
Okay.
There was one thing, and you don't have to go over it too much, but it's something I'll definitely have to do some more research on. But it's how to change a class, like change an ID tag of something in the HTML every time it mouses over to just add a new style and replace the other one.
Yeah, that's actually pretty cool. I mean, it's pretty, I can show you a pretty simple example. Let's say we do two classes, one that's one that sets the background to Alice Blue, and one that's two that sets the background to Blue Violet. We have these two things defined, and then we could do something like on. So this is actually, because this is a slightly different process. We're not going to do style. We're going to do, I think you can do two things. You can do class name and then set it to something. So I might set it to 1, and then on mouse out, set it to 2. So when I start this page, there's no class tied to that. And then if I hover over it, change color. And if I hover over again, it changed color.
Okay.
Two different blues. So like that's one way to do it. And in this case, you could actually just run a bunch of things in here and they'd all be valid classes. There is a different way, which I think is classes dot add, I think is also an alternative. But honestly, class name is pretty much the de facto way to do it. You just assign that whatever you give it to as the class.
Yeah, there was one that I think was class list with add and remove, which was
That's
just
the
more
one, yeah.
more syntax.
Yeah,
But
and that's
classes-
fine. And that's they both have their own use cases. This is might be good if you have a whole bunch of things, classes you want to just, you know, like you're not sure what they are and you just want to add one more, then or you, if you want to take one off without messing with the rest of them, then that makes it a little easier. Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah. Good questions.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that was a lot. I appreciate the effort in going through that.
No, for sure. What are the questions you all have?
I had a question about the next lab, which is the loop lab.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to do what it wants in terms of pushing the, oh Lord, let's see what it wants me to do.
Yeah, it's like pushing, you're talking about the array thing or the messages?
Yeah, not like logging the messages, but pushing them into a new array.